Buonasera a tutti, good evening and welcome to the Italian Radio Hour. Io sono Viviana e vorrei dare il benvenuto ai nostri ascoltatori da tutto il mondo. Grazie per essere con noi anche oggi mentre continuiamo il nostro viaggio per l'Italia e la cultura italiana. Today we have a very special guest who is returning to the Italian Radio Hour, Samuele Bozolla, who will lead us through the unfolding of an upcoming opera, The Marriage of Figaro, which will open at the Pittsburgh Opera on November the 5th until November the 13th at the Benedum Center. So Samuele will shed some light on the plot, on some fun facts behind it, and a personal connection to the opera itself. Ma prima, pubblicità. Parli italiano? Do you want to learn, improve, or master your Italian? Istituto Mondo Italiano can help. Located in the heart of Regent Square, Mondo Italiano offers small group classes and one-on-one private tutoring to help you learn Italian in no time. Visit us online at www.istitutomondoitaliano.org. Un caffè, per favore. My first cup of coffee sets the tone for my entire day, and I get my coffee at La Prima Espresso. La Prima has been brewing Pittsburgh's best coffee for nearly 35 years. Try any of their in-house roasted varieties of beans from all over the world at home, or come and enjoy an espresso or a cappuccino in any of their locations, where their friendly baristas and familiar faces will make you feel at home. Because a trip to La Prima is like a little trip to Italy, only closer to home. So we're now ready to bring Samuele Bozzolla with us tonight. Buonasera, Samuele.
Buonasera, signora. Come va? How are you?
Benissimo, benissimo. So we're very happy to have you back. Last time that you were on the program, you shared some very interesting stories and about your relationship with Luciano Pavarotti. And I would like for you to reintroduce yourself to our audience. You are what we would call un figlio d'arte. So there is indeed music. You grew up with music, also with some very important names in your family. And can we start with your grandfather and then your father and your parents?
Sure. My grandfather was the famous Broadway opera and I guess Hollywood star Ezio Pinza. He sang at the Met for 25 years, then went on to Broadway to do South Pacific with Mary Martin. And then his career ended in Hollywood, where he made 3 movies. So, yes, I think I saw my first opera when I was 5 years old. And a few weeks ago, I was talking to somebody, and they actually introduced me as being opera royalty. So there you go. So I've had my share, and in the Marriage of Figaro, what we're going to speak to tonight, the Nozze di Figaro in Italiano, is close to my heart because, well, 2 things. My grandfather sang it many times at the Metropolitan Opera as the title role in the Figaro, but also because my mother in 1975 began teaching at Duquesne University, and she founded the opera workshop there. And the first opera she ever did was the Marriage of Figaro. So she worked on it very, very hard. She had probably 6 weeks of rehearsals, and so I would go practically every night with her there and to listen. And so it was probably one of the first operas that I really, really understood what it meant to put on an opera, to have the orchestra with the singers and the staging and all that stuff. So besides being very familiar with the opera, I'm also, it's close to my heart because I'll always, remember my mother being, never home during those weeks and always, being at Duquesne and doing it. And actually, they didn't even do it on the stage. They did it at in their music school up on the 3rd floor. Mm-hmm. That's how primitive it was, the opera workshop at that time. She went on then to do other operas, but that was really the first one. And it was, it was a great success. And of course, it was all with students from Duquesne University Music School. So I'll always remember those days back in the mid 70s.
Mm-hmm. And so also also what you're going to do for us today, you're going to give us a synopsis of who is who, so to speak, just to bring some clarity. Obviously, we're not going to spoil anything about the current production, even because the opera itself did a wonderful session that is called Opera Up Close just a few days back. So this will put some additional curiosity to invite all our listeners to go and see the production that will open on November the 5th. So we're really going to we're going to start from the very basic, starting obviously with the composer and the period that Mozart was was in working on this opera. So tell us a little bit about Mozart, of course, and where is the libretto, who wrote the libretto, and so forth.
So Mozart, as we all know, was a musical genius. At 5 years old, he heard a mass in church, went home, and recomposed it note by note, which is something truly unbelievable. And when he wrote this opera, he was only 30 years old. Well, I say only because 30 years old is not that old. Unfortunately, he died just 5 years later. And at that time, it was hard to get into opera unless you had some Italian flair. Italian, the opera buffa, the funny opera, was really what really was, the time, the moment was that type of opera. So he thought the best way to get into the opera and break into the opera was through a librettist, and he found Lorenzo da Ponte. Mm-hmm. He was a very famous librettist and other things in Europe at the time. As a matter of fact, his real name was Emanuele Conigliano, Jewish, who also, the two of them then penned together Così fan tutte and Don Giovanni. Mm-hmm. The Ponte's name came from the Ponte is the person who then baptized him as Catholic, because his parents wanted to change from being Jews to being Catholic. So the priest his name was Da Ponte. So that's how he got his name. Da Ponte had a very famous life. As a matter of fact, he then later moved to the United States and taught at Columbia University, and he is actually buried in this country. So the two of them put on this opera, which was it comes from the play from the French writer Beaumarchais, and in French it's called La Folle Journée, which means the folly of the day, because the opera takes place in one day's time, and the two got together and they kind of a little bit restructured the play, of course, and the Marriage of Figaro was born. It premiered in Vienna in May of 1786. Again, an interesting date, because a few years later, what happened? The French Revolution. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of an interesting, because the way that the opera is structured, it was a little bit of like social strife, because you have Figaro and Susanna, who is the barber and the maid, and then you have the count and the countess, the hierarchy, and they're kind of back in those days, those people never really touched with each other. One was the count, and then there was everybody beneath him. And in the opera here, instead, there's kind of challenges between those two groups. So actually, the Viennese court had a hard time at first trying to really put this on the stage, but eventually, through the Ponte's influence, it was able to do it. Mm-hmm. Mozart, again, conducted the first two performances. So again, very interesting that you had that in opera going forward, like in La Bohème, Puccini was there at the beginning when Toscanini conducted, but here the actual composer conducted the first two performances.
Yes, and I was quite surprised to learn that from the information you had shared with me. So I was going to ask you, indeed, if it was something common that.
Back in those days, it was not as common, but Mozart, being the musician that he was, mm-hmm. The talent that he was, he just, he said, well, because back then the conductors were not as prominent as they were when Toscanini came in, and then Muti, Abbado, von Karajan, and those things. So, so back then the conductor was not the main point of the not the main, but did not share the opera as they did later on. So.
Okay, so this is an opera that is filled with characters. We have numerous characters, and we will try to shed some light again on who is who. So I'll keep a couple slides up just to, for those that will watch also the video interview, get themselves familiar with the names. So
the opera, in all honesty, is a bit confusing. The plot, there's a lot going on. There's all kind of characters moving back and forth. So I would suggest that whoever goes to see the opera really read the plot, the synopsis carefully, so that when they see the opera, they kind of understand. Because sometimes it's a little bit difficult if you don't know anything about it to go see it. You kind of get lost who's who and why and so forth.
And that's why we have you tonight with us, right?
Yeah, exactly. So again, as interesting enough, before I get to the characters, these characters are going to be somewhat the same as the characters that were put in a opera later on by Gioacchino Rossini called The Barber of Seville.
Exactly.
But The Barber of Seville really takes place before the Nozze di Figaro, even though the Nozze di Figaro it was written earlier. The Barber of Seville comes in written after, but it's the first play by Beaumarchais. So you have the Figaro, who's Count Almaviva's valet, who is engaged to Susanna, who is the Countess's maid. So there you go. Those two are together. Figaro and Susanna they both, I guess, work for the Count and the Countess, and they're supposed to gonna get married. Then you have Cherubino, which is a teenage page who's very flirtatious, and he's always trying to find a new girl to be with, and so forth and so on. Then, of course, you have the Countess and Count Almaviva, who appear in The Barber of Seville. The Countess in The Barber of Seville her name is Rosina. Then she marries and becomes the wife of the Count. The Count, as most counts were back in those days, was always looking for a new woman and falling in love, even though he was married already. So in this case, Count Almaviva is after Susanna. So there's lies one of the big problems of the opera. Then you have Dr. Bartolo, who's the guardian to the former countess. You have Marcellina, who's the housekeeper to Dr. Bartolo. You have Don Basilio, the music teacher, who teaches everybody music. And again, these characters are in the Barber of Seville. Then you have two sub-characters, Antonio, the gardener, who plays a little bit of a part towards the end of the second act, when he comes in and accuses Figaro of doing things. And then you have Barberina, who's Antonio's daughter. So those are the main characters. Again, Figaro, Susanna, Cherubino, the Countess, and Count Almaviva are the main characters that you see on stage really more than all the other ones. So that's kind of how this is all going to play out.
Yes, and the Marriage of Figaro is scored for what instruments? For which instruments?
The Marriage of Figaro, the orchestra is not that big as it was later with the Verdi and the Puccini operas and the Bellini operas. This is more, it has flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, horns, timpani, and strings, of course. But the orchestra is not as large as some of the orchestras later on. And then it has, of course, the harpsichord or a piano, because in those days there was a technique called recitativi, which were spoken words accompanied by the piano. So it was not really singing. It was a little bit more of a spoken dialogue that kind of interacted between characters. And the piano kind of gave them the chords to do the recitatives. That went away as time progressed. So Figaro was, Figaro. Mozart was one of the ones that used it a lot back then. This thing of recitatives. So.
And so it seems to be also among the opera singers, one of the favorite operas to interpret, right?
The jovial opera. It's very, very funny. There's a lot of things going on. The music is beautiful, and there's a lot of. It's fun to sing. It's a fun piece to sing especially for again the Figaro, the Susanna, there's a lot of movement, and it's not. I mean, there's some arias that are demanding as far as the vocal technique is, but there's also, it's also not as demanding, let's say, as you would get in listening to a opera by, again, maybe Verdi and things. It's a little bit less demanding, I would say, as far as the high notes and things like that. But it's a very, very, very funny opera to sing, and so it moves so quickly, even though the opera's 3 hours and it's 4 acts. Most productions are Act 1 and 2, then intermission, and Act 3 and 4. That's how it's usually broken down. But it's about 3 hour opera, and but it moves really quickly, especially the first 2 acts. So.
Okay, so now let's get into kind of the synopsis of the opera, starting with Act 1, where we expecting to see and learn during the first act.
Right. So the opera starts out, of course, first with the overture, and the overture sets the mood for the opera, because the overture is very quick, but there's nothing in the overture there's no music within the overture that is the music of the opera, which other overtures have pieces of the opera in there, because that's why it's called an overture. It's the beginning, opening. In this case, it does not have any music associated with the actual opera, but it's a very, very famous overture. It's probably one of the most famous overtures that people recognize. So the opera opens with Figaro and Susanna. Again, they're preparing for their wedding, and then but Susanna tells Figaro, listen, I'm being pursued by the Count. So then Bartolo and Marcellina, they're trying to hold Figaro to a promise to marry Marcellina, because he has to pay back a loan to Bartolo that he has, and the loan was done so that he could, I guess, afford a wedding with Susanna. So the page then, Cherubino, tells Susanna of his love for the Countess as the Count arrives. Then the Count hides and overhears the attempted seduction of Susanna. Then Don Basilio, the music teacher, comes in and is in turn forces Cherubino to move from his hiding place, because Cherubino is hiding, because once the Count comes in to talk to Susanna, Cherubino has to hide, because he or she doesn't want the Count to see her. So there's a lot of things going on, and the Count then finds Cherubino and says, you know what? You're going to go and pack up for the army, because he doesn't want Cherubino to be around anymore, because he's a nuisance to him, because he's looking for women as much as the Count is. So he says, no, this is not going to work anymore. You're going to go and join the army. So that's kind of where the Act 1 is. Act 2, again, it's Susanna is trying to figure out how to get the Count not to be with her. And so they kind of hold together a plot with Cherubino to see if they can do something to get the Count out of the way. So as Cherubino is being disguised, the Count arrives, and Cherubino is pushed into an adjoining closet. The Count hears all these noises, and he says, what's going on? Who is in that? What's going on? So he tries to break down the door, but he's not successful. So Cherubino then jumps out of the window while Susanna takes his place. When the Count returns, he finds that it's Susanna in the closet. To his surprise, he says, because he was sure that it was Cherubino. So when he opens the door, he said, oh. So then he's forced to apologize for his suspicions. So then, to add to all this confusion, Figaro arrives, and he's irritated because the gardener says that, he's the Cherubino jumped in the garden, they're blaming Figaro. And he says, well, yeah. Then finally, Bartolo and Marcellina arrive, and they want to claim Figaro to get the money. So the act closes one of the most beautiful 20 minutes of uninterrupted music, which is, again, the musical genius of Mozart. That they all, doing their thing. So the Countess, Susanna, and Figaro singing their demise, and you have Marcellina, Bartolo, and the Count claiming their victory. So that's how the act ends. It's very that to me is probably one of the most beautiful pieces of music, not only in the opera but in opera in general. That those 20 uninterrupted music, it really is amazing. Act 3, Figaro stalls Marcellina by telling her that she's of noble birth and cannot marry without her parents' consent. So he's trying to stall because he doesn't want to marry. He's much older than he is, and so he's not interested. And he's interested in Susanna. Then he reveals a birthmark on his arm, where then Marcellina, realizes that she and Bartolo are really his parents. So Marcellina, who wanted to marry Figaro, is really his mother. So all of a sudden, they all embrace. And he embraces Marcellina. And at the same time as he embracing Marcellina, Susanna enters. And she sees him embracing the woman that she knows might want to marry him. So she's furious. But of course, everything is explained. And so she joins in the celebration. Then the Countess has dictated that the note that Susanna is to pass to the Count to make it so that the Count will rendezvous with Susanna, because that's what he wants to do. But really, Susanna is going to be the Countess. So again, subterfuge, masking of the thing. Again, Mozart and Da Ponte with their scores and their libretto, geniuses. Finally, Act 4, everybody's jealous of each other. And again, to make it maybe just a little simple, what happens at the end is when the Count is going to meet with Susanna, but it's not, it's the Countess. So the Count realizes that all of a sudden. And then again, one of the most beautiful parts of the opera, he asks her, Contessa, perdono, 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 meaning Countess, I ask you forgiveness, please forgiveness. And, the Countess forgives her husband, and then the opera ends. So as you can see, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of characters, who's who and who's not. But that's the gist of the opera.
Indeed. So, but I have a feeling that there is a story behind the story.
Yeah, I mean, all right. So most operas, people think that the composer sits down and pens the opera and the librettist on the other side writes the music. Now, that's not how it works. For example,
that's how it works.
It's not how it works. First of all, there's always fights between the two of them, between the librettists. I mean, again, Puccini and Iacozza, what wrote Bohème, they so much disliked each other that they used to talk from one end of the room to the other, because otherwise they'd beat each other up. And Da Ponte and Mozart were not that bad, but they had a lot of discussions, to the point where some of the acts, arias, were, let's say, 1, 2, 3, but all of a sudden Da Ponte said, no, it shouldn't be 1, 2, 3. 3 should be 1, 2 should be 3, 3 should be 1. So they would go back and rearrange stuff like. So, for example, in the third act, one aria was at the beginning, and they said, no, we don't want it at the beginning. We want to move it later on in the act because it makes more sense. So those things are not widely known to people. Again, it's not that. And again, as we said before, the opera was taken from the Beaumarchais play, and it became, again, a kind of a rage with the aristocracy. So, and a lot of times it would be done in kind of secret because they didn't want the aristocracy to see that. What else can I tell you? When it was first performed, it was a triumph, but it was a triumph that was a little bit subdued because of the political strife. A lot of operas were not successes. Again, going back to La Bohème, it was a total failure almost. People didn't like it, so it had to be redone. Figaro instead was embraced right away. But it was interesting because, as I said before, it was done just a few years before the French Revolution, and so the French Revolution was all about class. That's one of the reasons it happened. So, with that in mind, the opera is about class, because all of a sudden you have Figaro and Susanna who kind of overthrow the count and his advances to Susanna. They fool him with the help of the Countess. And the other thing is, here we have really the first time maybe in opera that the women take the lead role in the opera, even though they're, meaning when I say the lead role is they do things that make things happen. In other words, the Count and Susanna are the ones that at the end play together to fool the count and make the count look like making it look bad, and to say perdono, perdono, forgive me. So even that's a little different, because again, you don't have that strong male role that you have in other operas. Here you have the females who are kind of leading the charge.
Mm-hmm. And that's very, very, very unusual, as you just
Yes.
indicated. Let's focus a little bit about the music, the overture, and La Vendetta, and maybe one of the famous areas that again links you back to one of your grandfather's interpretations. So what can you tell us?
Sure. The overture again is it's the first of three collaborations between him and Da Ponte with the Così fan tutti and the Don Giovanni. The overture starts with a busy whispering with the strings. Sort of like, that it might get you, it might not get you. You're kind of, it's kind of whispering. Then all of a sudden there's a big bang, and then the brass comes in with the trumpets and the drums. And then again, the whole overture is scampering. It kind of follows along with what you're going to expect from the opera.
Okay, so let me see if I can just put in just a few seconds. Again, we want to just get a feel for it, but not.
The beginning of the overture, you'll hear a quick.
Oops, that was a little less than the 2 seconds I had in mind. Let me try this one more time. Okay, so that was just to give it a little tasting. Yes.
With that strings, and then it comes with the bang. And again, it's a everybody here, everybody that knows opera knows that overture, and it's fairly technically demanding because of the speed that it has to be played in order to create that playful and comedic effect. So it's really a difficult overture to play, especially for the strings, because they really move. And then again, you have different conductors that play it in different speeds, because again, each conductor takes its own personal liberty. But for the most part, it's played at a very quick pace. So La Vendetta is the main aria that Dr. Bartolo sings. And it's about, he doesn't like Figaro because he prevented him from marrying the current Countess of Almaviva, which is which was Rosina in the Barber of Seville, which was Dr. Bartolo's ward at that time. He describes the revenge that he will try to achieve against Figaro. And so again, La Vendetta, the vengeance. And in the music, you can hear La Vendetta. It's very, very, very appropriate the way the music is to the way if you think of a vengeance. So.
And so we're going to then get to the area, Non più andrai. Okay.
Non più andrai, yes, that's one of the famous arias that Figaro sings, and it's very jovial and very militaristic, because the aria is about Figaro is teasing Cherubino, the young lad, that he has to go to the military, and that's a very Spartan thing. It's very, everything has to be done. You have to get up at 6. You have to do this. You have to do that, which is completely the different than the life that Cherubino is used to in the Count's palace, which is again very flirtatious. So he tells him, hey, what are you going to do? You're going to go march through, marciare through fango, march through the mud, and this. So it's a very regal, very militaristic way of composing. And the piece you're going to hear is Non più andrai, the excerpt, It's my grandfather singing it. Probably this recording was probably in the early 30s or so, and it's probably done. This was probably taken from the Metropolitan Opera performance or through a record, but it's probably in the 30s performance.
So here is Ezio Pinza with Non più andrai, and then you, Samuele, tell me when to stop. Okay, let's enjoy.
Non più andrai, farfallone amoroso, notte e giorno d'intorno girando, delle belle quando in riposo, narcisetto adancino d'amor. Delle belle quando in riposo, narcisetto adancino d'amor. Non più avrai questi bei pennacchi, quel cappello leggero galante, quella chioma, quell'aria brillante.
Okay, we could be listening to your what a, I don't know, not only what a pleasure, what a privilege to be raised in such a musical household. Maybe we'll leave a few minutes at the end to talk more about in depth with your family and
so, sure. Again, you know, I having the background that I have, you know, what I'm going to say next might not hit home with everybody, but if you listen to him and you listen to other artists, not that the other artists are not as good, but his artistry of singing, the way he pronounced, first of all, his diction was unbelievable in Italian. And then the way he really sings that aria as it should be sung, the way I think Mozart wanted it to be sung, so distinct and so regal that well, of course, he had the deep voice that he had. So you know, he really, because if you listen to other singers sing it, sometimes it's not as pronounced as he does it. You know, non piandrai, it's very, very militaristic and, you know.
Molto scandito, molto, very precise, as you said, indeed.
My grandfather studied roles, you know, forever. I mean, I remember one day my mom came home late in his career and he was looking at the score of Don Giovanni, which is another Mozart opera. And my mother said, what are you doing, Dad? You've sung this opera so many times. And he said, every time you look at this, I learn something new. So that's the type of artist he was. So
indeed. So is there, then you have Porgi Amor?
Porgi Amor to me is one of the most beautiful arias for a woman that was written. It's so beautiful. First of all, it's interesting because the first, I don't know, 30 some seconds are just music. And that usually doesn't happen in arias. Arias, you have maybe a 4 or 5, 10 second introduction and then the singer comes in. Here you don't. You have this, you know, I don't know how many seconds, but it's at least 25, 30 seconds of just music. And so it's really one of the highlights of the opera. And again, it's set in a major chord, not a minor chord. And then it's in the Countess's mood is so sad and contemplative because, you know, she's thinking, oh, I want his love, but I'm not sure that he's loving me anymore because maybe he wants somebody else. And so she sees that, you know, that idea of maybe losing the love of her life, and so she sings as Porgi Amor, meaning oh my love, you know, and I just think it's a beautiful aria, and she's on stage with her own, but by herself, which is incredible. So if you want to play, we'll just play until she starts to sing, so that you can hear that introduction of the music, just the music.
Okay, 1 second. This is still your grandfather beautifully singing and me trying to advance the technology to the next slide. Okay, I think we are indeed in the right place. Can you hear it?
No.
Okay. So let's try this way. Okay. I was enjoying it all by myself and then. Okay, take 2. Okay, wonderful, wonderful.
Mhm.
So beautiful. What else can you tell us about some, or either about this area or some of the other, maybe the finale?
The finale act, as I mentioned earlier, it's one of the most beautiful finales in music. It's 20 minutes of continuous music, and it goes from a trio, a duet, to a trio, to a quartet, to a quintet, to a septet. There's actually 7 people on stage singing at the same time. Something that also, I believe, there's a lot of sextets in opera, but septets, it's not as prominent. But again, it's everybody playing off each other and doing this and doing that. It's hard for me to describe in words to me. It's better to listen to it and then describe it to yourself than me telling you this and that. Except that it's really everybody against everybody, and there's everybody. There's Figaro with Susanna, and then there's a Count, and then there's Dr. Bartolo, and they're taking sides, and they're thinking they're going to win, and the other trio says they're going to win. So it's really an amazing piece of music that should be listened to more than once, of course. But again, it's I don't know, I can't really describe it in words, because it's the genius of Mozart. Really, I mean, the genius of Mozart comes through again. I mean, he's the genius of geniuses in music to me, but it comes through again in this 20-minute finale of the second act.
So we don't want to spoil all of it for our listeners. So I would like to divert a little bit the conversation to some of the fun facts about the Marriage of Figaro, Le Nozze di Figaro, that not maybe everyone might be familiar with. I know that you have a few of them that you would like to share. Even, for instance, what did other composers think about this opera?
Well, I mean, let's take 2. The first one is Brahms, and I'll quote what he says. He says, "In my opinion, each number in Figaro is a miracle.
Wow.
It's a total beyond me how anyone could create anything so perfect. Nothing like it was ever done again, not even by Beethoven." So this is Johannes Brahms, again, a peer and someone who was, a musical genius himself. Then you have Haydn. He said he wrote that the opera in his dreams. So Dvorak simply declared that Moses is sweet sunshine. So again, everybody knows that if there was a genius in opera, it was Mozart. Or actually, I should say, if there was a genius in classical music, it was Mozart. Yes. From the time, again, the man only lived 35 years, and all that he wrote, opera, he wrote symphonies, he wrote a beautiful requiem. He wrote quintets, quartets, all those things. It's just amazing. If you listen to all his music, it's just truly, truly unbelievable. So.
And you don't have to be familiar with the opera to actually recognize the Marriage of Figaro's music, right? Because that's been adopted.
So many movies. It's parts of it here and there. And I guess the 2 main ones is the overture is used in the King's Speech. It was back in, I guess, 2014, a movie. And I guess the most famous movie that it was in Shawshank Redemption, where the character is in jail, and he puts on the Sullaria, which is a beautiful duet between Susanna and the Countess, and they sing, and he plays it on the loudspeaker all over the yard where the inmates are. And then he says something like, "I've never heard something so beautiful." I don't know what they're saying, because they're singing in Italian, but it can't be anything but beautiful from the melody. And again, the duet is unbelievable. It can actually bring tears to your eyes just to listen to these 2 women who are they know that the Count is after Susanna, but they join forces to allow the Countess to thwart the advances to Susanna, and so that the Countess could get the Count back. And that's what happens at the end when she says "Perdona, perdona." So again, probably that's one of the Shawshank Redemption is everybody's always referring back to that scene. even in the movie, it's a great scene. I mean, even in the movie, you just sit there and you go, wow, you know, because everybody, you imagine all these prisoners in the yard, and all of a sudden they hear this music on this loudspeaker and they stop and they just look up at the speakers thinking it's just like a voice of God or whatever. You know, it's almost celestial in kind. So it's very, very interesting. So.
Then also, as we were talking before this conversation, the term trouser roll came out. Can you tell me, can you explain to our listeners?
Sure. Trouser roll is something that happened in opera early on again. It wasn't something that was then followed through, but it was the role was good. Okay, let's go back. So we know that in the opera, early opera, there was the castrati, which
indeed. And
when boy was young at 5 years old, they made him. They did a medical procedure that allowed them to sing as women. So because back in the days, women were not allowed on stage. You know, the church and all that. So they used
Farinelli being probably one
exactly
of them.
is the main guy. But then as time went on, you know, they said, well, maybe we can change a little bit this and that. And the trouser roll they call it trouser roll because it's the woman singing it's not singing a man's part, but the woman is a man, I guess, dressed as a man in trousers, but is the voice and the character is the woman. So in this case, it's Cherubino, who's a man, but is played by a woman. So the voice is high, is very high, but it's not a castrato, it's an actual woman that now is singing the role of a man. And in this case, again, Cherubino, who is the flirtatious young boy, is played by a woman. So that's what the trouser roll is. That's what that means.
Okay, Samuele, in a minute or less, can you tell us a little bit about what is behind writing an opera? And maybe you have touched upon a little bit about but yes, you have a minute to tell us what goes behind writing an opera.
Writing an opera is a very complicated thing because two things. One, the composer has to write the music, and the music has to, you know, not only does he writing the music for the singers, but he also has to write the music for the orchestra. So it's a two parallel thing. And then you have the librettist who has to put the music to words. And those words have to be good enough that the singer can sing them, of course. And then they have to follow the story and they have to kind of make sense. So that's why you have the librettist and the composer working hand in hand for days, months, whatever, to make one piece. They have to take three things actually, the orchestra, the singers, and then the words, put them all into one and make it an opera. And again, amazing, this opera, for 3 hours, you listen to the music, it took 6 weeks.
Okay, well, Samuele, you have been instrumental in, again, taking us along onto this this masterpiece of Mozart. And I personally look forward to seeing you on November the 11th, because we have actually our own tickets for the same night.
Right. And again, if you go to see it, whoever's listening to this interview, if you go to see it, please enjoy it and please just enjoy the opera. If you go there with knowing about the synopsis, that'll take away from always looking up to the op trans, which a lot of people do. And sometimes I think that takes away from the actual experience of the opera.
Yes, a little bit. It has to be a little bit of compromise between looking up and enjoying the music. But unfortunately, our hour is up. Il big band has to stop. It's time for us to say arrivederci alla prossima. We want to thank you for tuning into the program. And if you have any questions or comments, or if you have any travel topics that you would like to discuss, please send us an email at theitalianradiohour@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. Remember, if you or any of your family or friends have missed a prior episode or would like to listen to this episode again, please visit our website at www.istitutomonditaliano.org and click on the Italian Radio Hour tab. We would like to thank our guest, Samuele Bozolla, our sponsors, Istituto Mondo Italiano, La Prima Espresso, e La Boara for the music. And also there is a link to purchase discounted tickets to the upcoming production of The Marriage of Figaro, now available at our website, www.istitutomonditaliano.org, or you can go directly and purchase your tickets and use the coupon code POIMI to enjoy a discount on your ticket purchase. If you're not living in the Pittsburgh area or you might be out of town, remember you can always catch us streaming live at khbradio.com every Thursday at 5 o'clock. And also be sure to like us on Instagram and Facebook at The Italian Radio Hour. Until next time, alla prossima, ciao ciao!